Good morning, and thank you, Olga. That hymn, which many of you may recognize as the tune to the doxology and other traditions that you may have been raised with. It's in our Unitarian Universalist hymnal with the words of Samuel Longfellow that begin with joy. We claim the growing light, advancing thought and widening view. Each day of this season, we take another step across the threshold of growing light, moving from the darkest, deepest days of winter toward the hope of spring. We virtually join together this morning, coming from the pushes and pulls of participation in this 21st century pandemic political world. Here, we gather into a space set just a hair breadths apart from those stresses, if only for a brief moment, if we but allow ourselves. Here, we gather boundaried by the timeless truths, hopes, and inspirations of the stories of the generations, the wisdom of the ancients viewed from a liberal, which can mean a broader perspective. Longfellow continued with these words in his poem: "With wider view come loftier goals, with fuller light, more good to see." Let us bring ourselves into seeing more good and fuller light with the lighting of our common, and if you have one at home, your home chalice. Today, we're going to light our chalice together and speak words together that will be on your screen in a moment. So if you have a chalice or a candle, please, I'll give the direction when to light it, and we'll all do our best. As the worship team here often says, "Pobody's nerfect." Our chalice lighting this morning combines two different chalice lightings. And I have had the attributions for the writing put on the slide, but we will not speak this aloud. We light this beacon of hope and sign of our quest for truth and meaning. If you are able, you may light your chalice now. And let us recite together the words on your screen. Flame, friend of our most ancient ancestors, we kindle you now to make you visible in this time. Yet in truth you burn always, in the unique worth of each person, in the imagination, in the turning of the heart to sorrow or joy, in the call to hope, and in the call to justice. Burn bright before us, burn bright within us. We continue to bring the light of hope, the light of imagination into our hearts as we consider the origin story of our first hymn this morning, "Morning Has Broken." I share some words that have been amended that were written by Dr. Hahn, a professor of sacred music at Perkins School of Theology for the United Methodist Church. "Morning Has Broken" first appeared in this country in the Presbyterian Hymn Book 1955. But it wasn't until Cat Stevens, now Yusuf Islam, sang it on one of his albums in 1971 that the song became well known, and as a result has been included in most Protestant hymnals since that time. Eleanor Farjeon, who wrote the poet who wrote those lyrics, was born in Westminster, England in the middle of the 19th century and lived to the middle of the 20th century. The tune, Bunesin, was first printed in a book of songs and hymns in the middle of the 19th century, but it was paired with a text by a Scottish poet who lived on the Isle of Mull and was born near the village of Bunesin, for which the tune is named. One editor notes that text effectively links and expresses the creation stories in Genesis 1 and John 1 and reminds us that each new day is a gift from God. The morning sings in the sounds of the blackbird. The second stanza closes with a reference to walking in the Garden of Eden, and the final stanza invites us to personalize this experience. Mine is the sunlight, mine is the morning, and share in the possibility. Though God is not a concept all Unitarian Universalists embrace, we all have grappled with or carry within us some concept of enduring mystery, presence of compassion, kindness, hospitality, love, and the balance of those concepts, destruction, ending, loss, and in the universe. We typically also have some ideas about a source for the universe, be it the Big Bang or the more current ideas among theoretical physicists about the universe's beginnings, or God, or simply unknown and unknowable. Clearly, Cat Stevens, now Yusuf Islam, has devoted his life to connecting the holy and the sacred through a life of religious journey and spiritual journey. Hawley ends his writing with this: at first glance, Morning Has Broken may seem naive in our current polluted environment of waning freshwater supplies, greenhouse gases, and smogs. Unlike the earlier days of the 20th century when the poem was written, we know the Earth's resources are limited and its beauty is ours to preserve and foster. Yet we all dream for a day when the beauty of the earth may be restored and that the rising of the morning sun will be a symbol of hope where all share in the earth's abundance. And I would add, in the earth's care. Let us join together muted on our computers as Olga leads us and sings Morning Has Broken.
Morning has broken like the first morning, never has spoken like the first bird. Praise for the singing, praise for the morning, praise for the spring came fresh from the world. the one night hidden so plain. Praise within nation, praise every morning, God's recreation of the new day.
Thank you, Olga. Good morning. We have a story this morning about the holiday Imbolc, which brings us to the threshold of spring, and it was written by Star Hawk. Once there were two children named Bridget and Alex who lived in a land where winter brought deep snows and much cold. One year, the winter was especially harsh. Bridget and Alex grew tired of staying in the house for so many days. The air was too cold to play outside. How long will the winter last? They asked their mother. Only the goddess knows, the mother said. Well, where can we find her to ask her? I'll show you on Bridget's Eve, said the mother. So on Bridget's Eve, the two children lit a candle with their mother's help, placed it on the table, and looked deep into the flame. After a while, the flame seemed to grow until it filled the whole room with a glorious light, and the goddess appeared. Her hair was bright as living fire, her face dark as old wood, her cloak golden as a sunbeam. I am Bridget of the holy well and sacred flame, she said. Why have you called me? We called you to ask a question. How long will the winter last? The winter will last until clean water rises in the sacred well and bright flames burn on every hearth. And then she disappeared. Well, what does that mean? The two children asked their parents, but they did not have an answer. The next day, the children woke up early and decided they would go from house to house in the village and see whether a good fire was burning on every hearth. And they would ask everyone if they knew where there was a sacred well. So they did. They went from house to house all through their village, and on every hearth a warm fire burned, and the people were kind to them and offered them good things to eat and warm things to drink, but no one knew about a sacred well. At last they had visited almost every house in the village. The only one left was the cottage of Old Man Mad Dog. Nobody liked Old Man Mad Dog. He was crusty and mean. When children came near his cottage, he yelled at them and shook his big walking stick. From the very edge of the village, Bridget and Alex could see the roof of Old Man Mad Dog's house. There was no smoke coming out of his chimney. Surely the goddess couldn't have meant that we were supposed to light a fire on his hearth, thought the children. We're afraid of him. He'll probably yell at us and shake his stick. But still, I think we should go and see if he has a fire lit. So they did. When they reached the house, the door was closed. Maybe he's not home, Bridget said. Maybe we should just go away. Let's look in the window first, Alex suggested. And they peered in the small glass window and saw Old Man Mad Dog lying on his bed, and there was no fire on the hearth. Maybe he's sick, Bridget said. We better go and see. So they entered the house. It was cold as the air outside, and Old Man Mad Dog lay on his bed moaning and shivering with a fever. We've got to help him. They brought him a drink of water and covered him with a blanket, and then the children lit a fire on the hearth, and soon the entire room glowed warm. They found some potatoes and carrots and onions and cooked up a nice hot soup. Finally, Old Man Mad Dog was warm enough to sit up and drink some of the soup. Pesky children, he said in a gruff voice. I never did like children. I suppose I ought to thank you. Well, that would be polite, Bridget told them. But what we really want to know is whether you've heard of a holy well anywhere around here. Holy well, jingle bell, he said. The only well I know is that old fallen down well in the woods, and it's all full of garbage. Bridget and Alex looked at each other. Garbage? That didn't sound very holy. But still, it was the only well that anyone had told them about at all. I guess we better go look at it, Alex said. The children journeyed into the woods and came to a small clearing. In the center was a ring of stones, all tumbled down and scattered. They looked inside and saw nothing but a small puddle of frozen mud, all choked with leaves and garbage. Could that be the holy well? Doesn't look much like one, Alex said, but maybe if we clear it out a bit, we'll be able to see some water. So they went about clearing it out. After some time, Alex said, it's getting dark. We'll have to come back tomorrow to finish. Oh, well, at least we've begun, Bridget said. You have done well, a voice said from behind them. They turned and saw the goddess. You've begun the work, and that is all anyone can do. Is this your holy well? Bridget asked the goddess. Yes, it is. A long time ago, the people of the village tended my well carefully, keeping it clean and dressing it with flowers in the spring. But now they've forgotten the way here, just as they have forgotten the law of kindness to strangers. Without the warmth of loving kindness, how can the days grow warm again? We'll remind them, Bridget promised. We'll bring everyone out here to finish cleaning up the well. The goddess smiled. Good. You have lit my fire and cleaned my well. And now I will tell you a secret. Inside the heart of every boy and every girl is a holy well, full of the waters of love and joy and new ideas. This is the well you must keep clean, because it can be easily choked by hatred and greed and selfishness. And inside of you is also a fire you must tend and feed and keep burning, so that you will grow and be strong and wise and brave. We will do our best, they promised. And now will spring come, Bridget asked. Spring will come, the goddess promised, and she winked at them. Spring will come as soon as winter is over. And it did.
Thank you, as always, Deborah, for that wonderful story. I discovered Starhawk, the author of that story, and Wicca, as did many Unitarian Universalists, especially women, in the late 1980s and early 1990s through an adult religious education program titled Cakes for the Queen of Heaven. This was intended as a 12-week spiritual growth experience based on what was at that time the still fairly new expanding scholarship in feminist theology. Theology is the study of God, a not quite ancient but old and established study in our Western tradition that focused almost exclusively on God the Father. Theology is the study of the goddess, of the feminine aspects of the divine and the sacred. Here in our Western, Eurocentric, white-centric culture and heritage, the predominant formal religious studies and ideas relegated and reduced the feminine to a few restrictive archetypes. The evil and sinister Eve who led Adam astray, and the sainted and sacred virginal Mary, mother barely touched by her own femininity. There's much that could be said about this wonderful curricula, Cakes for the Queen of Heaven, but that will have to wait for another sermon or speak to one of your fellow congregants who may have been through this experience. My experience with cake some 30 years ago now was one of having my entire set of assumptions about the nature of life and being, of my life and my being as a female, challenged and disrupted. It was a metaphorical earthquake for my being, my spirit, and my soul. And after the ground beneath me was torn asunder, some way was needed to find where the new solid ground beneath my feet would lay for the future. Some way to learn a new landscape for living my life, my feminine, and as Mary Oliver says so eloquently, this one wild and precious life, because I could not turn back to the world before my metaphorical earthquake. One of the final weeks of Cakes introduced us to Wicca. Encyclopedia Britannica Online defines Wicca as a predominantly Western movement whose followers practice witchcraft and nature worship, and who see it as a religion based on pre-Christian traditions of Northern and Western Europe. While I think many Wiccans today might take issue with aspects of that definition, it does capture what we were presented with in that session of Cakes in the beginning of the 1990s. It doesn't capture fully the relationship and emphasis I found in the pre-Christian, primarily Celtic, sometimes Scandinavian, and the natural world's emphasis on or honoring of the power of the feminine. And so for about a dozen years, this became the story that I immersed myself and my family in, even as we remain deeply connected to our Unitarian Universalist Church. If there are some with us today who are not familiar with Unitarian Universalism, that may sound a bit strange. That as Unitarian Universalists, we can engage in the spiritual, liturgical, regular practice that is not specifically Unitarian Universalist, while maintaining our faith and our covenant with one another as Unitarian Universalists. But this is one of the gifts of our faith, that we are non-creedal, and we welcome and even encourage spiritual growth and exploration. We value the liturgical stories that shape lives into ones of deeper meaning and principled action in living, though they may not be our stories. So as my family embraced an earth-centered and focused liturgical story to shape our lives around, I began to ground myself anew in this story. We were attending to daily, seasonal, and annual cycles of nature within us as human beings, around us and between us on this earth we share with multiple life forms, the interconnectedness, even with the ones we don't necessarily like. In my case, mosquitoes and snakes. And the cycles beyond us, the cycles of the universe, of the lives of the stars and galaxy and moon, the sheer billions of years of Earth's development before we humans even showed up. The liturgical year in the Celtic pagan calendar has 8 Sabbaths, Imbolc or Candlemas, or in Christianity, St. Brigid's Day, here in the US, Groundhog's Day. This is the season in the Northern Hemisphere of the growing light that Samuel Longfellow spoke of. More on this in a moment. Next comes the vernal equinox in March, when we have equal amounts of light and dark. And after that comes Beltane, or May 1st, or May Day in a secular calendar. It celebrated the beginning of the growing season, the pregnancy of the earth, as well as of humans. Beltane is followed by the summer solstice around June 21st, where you have the longest day, longest amount of light. Then by Lugnasa, the first harvest and the rise of the corn king. So the child born at the beginning of the year is now the king and is coming into fullness. The autumnal equinox toward the end of September is followed by Samhain, or All Saints' Day, or Halloween, as it is known in Christian and secular traditions. Winter comes, the goddess goes away, takes with her the light. The corn king too dies, and we await the rebirth of light on the winter solstice, or Yule, celebrated just days before Christmas. And that's the shape, though not all of the story that goes around the Celtic year. It involves the female going from youngness and fullness of fertility in the early part of the year into giving birth, into what is born in the agricultural fields as well as in real life, to its coming to maturation, where it's nutritious and feeds us, and its return to the earth and into the ground and the nurturing, nourishing darkness before it arises again. Today, we are on the eve of Imbolc. It celebrates the growing light with the lighting of candles and restoring the entrances to sacred wells from the winter's growth and the winter's ice, so that the water might begin to flow as the thaw arrives. Imbolc is also often celebrated with milk and eggs because in northern agricultural climes, this growing light is the beginning of the lambing season, the returning of the hens to doing more active laying, which they don't do as well in the dark season, and to the cows and sheep to producing milk or more milk. Each of those activities is born of the feminine, for it is females who produce eggs and milk. And in many cultures, it is the female who's responsible for bringing the water from the wells into the household. These simple pleasures of focusing on eggs and sunlight and the moon's phases and the stars in the sky and each new growth happening underground and slowly coming above the soil widen my sense of meaning and purpose and value. It literally grounded me to this earth and to the sun and the stars and the moon above. Another aspect of Wicca has to do with finding one's own power. This is not power over others. This is the power to act within our own lives from our own principles and values. Sound is a literal way in which often Wiccan rituals demonstrate the gathering of this power. The human voice and drumming can be elemental to this, growing this understanding. So let us breathe together as we listen to Olga singing this song by Leanne Vetch that demonstrates using sound to gather the power and then allowing it to return back into the earth from which it came. Let us join together in the spirit of prayer, spirit of life, source of all. We connect as best we are able these days across invisible networks that may still seem magical to some of us. We carry grief in our hearts for the deaths and illnesses brought on by this pandemic. We carry grief not just for those with COVID, but for those whose other physical and emotional health are at risk, whose needs are not met, or who are isolated because of the pandemic. We carry anxiety and concern for our futures, for the fate of our democracy, for our health, for those whose beliefs and ideas deeply trouble us and whom we have not yet understood. We may know the guilt that comes with having enough security in these difficult times when so many around us are losing their sense of security and their incomes. Each of us has moments of succumbing to despair and hopelessness, of telling ourselves there is nothing we can do. And yet we know that there are cycles that continue through the ages, cycles of destruction and repair, of loss and sorrow, turning to strength and courage, of the ongoing turning of the seasons, even in this time of severe climate stress. May we, in community and individually, find the hearts of compassion, kindness, hospitality, and nurture that need to be relighted. And may the tinder and kindling they need show itself as well. May we, in community and individually, unclog the openings of our sacred wells, that the springs of well-being, of peace, of interconnectedness water our landscapes too long parched by a culture of more things, more impossible pursuit of perfection. So may it be, within, among, between, and beyond, in the many names of all that is holy and sacred. Amen. There are many liturgical narratives around which we can shape our lives. Most have a cyclical annual rhythm to them, shaping our living in each year, but providing continuity for the unknown generations of the future. And most importantly, providing access to the wisdom gathered in the past so that it can be useful into the future. The opening up of the discarded, misused holy well. We need this hope, this possibility of the future to thrive as human beings. We need this hope to thrive as meaningful spiritual beings, and we need these liturgical narratives. We especially need it in times of despair and anxiety. The many possible narratives show us what to worship, which we Unitarian Universalists like to say is recognizing what is of worth. What is worthy of our praise and our thanksgiving? What is worthy of sacrificing for, and what is only fool's gold? Shiny, attractive, appearing valuable, but not. Won't withstand the test of time. Some of us arrange our lives around the stories of the Gautama Siddhartha and becoming a Buddha. Some around the story of Moses and the shape of a Jewish liturgical year with its festivals, heroes and anti-heroes, or the story of Muhammad or Confucius, or the story of culture that Confucius tells. Of course, over the generations, these stories become infused and often rigidly fused with the culture and the place where they arose. And so in time, they, like the holy well, need to have the garbage cleared away from their source. I have always been taken with the story of Jesus, the story as I learned it in the lap of this very liberal, religious, mid-20th century humanist tradition. So when I entered a Christian seminary and brought my pagan, earth-centered practices and grounding with me, my heart was sympathetic to the story of Jesus and a contemplative Christianity as it arose throughout the Celtic lands. There is a distinctly Celtic Christianity that is very grounded in the natural world and recognizes the same sacred well as Brigid. These days, I'm beginning to explore the narrative of a life lived through the Jewish liturgical year because that is the religion and also the culture of my ancestors. What are the narratives that inform and shape your life? Which ones were you given? Which ones have you embraced? Many people come to Unitarian Universalism when the religious narrative they have been given feels like a prison binding them to something that has no real meaning. Others come when the narrative is simply not large enough to include the reality they are experiencing and growing into. Here, in Unitarian Universalism, one can be at home without a narrative, and that is often our strength. But I believe that it also can be part of our weakness. Some of us stay rooted in a single rich narrative for our lives. Some of us get stuck in a place with a single narrative, and others grow into the narrative, and the narrative grows with them, imbuing practices and stories and rituals and tradition with ever deeper meaning for themselves, but most importantly, for their relationship with the holy and the sacred, however it is named, that arises in our human living and being, especially our relationships with others and the world around us. The beauty of liturgical stories and rituals and practices is that, like the goddesses' words, they are not roadmaps with a set of literal and clear directions. They are tapestries woven in and around truth, beauty, and wisdom. And because they are not a clear roadmap from point A to point B, they are a wide doorway to their truths. Anyone can fit through. In the story we just heard, we hear this paradigm, this indirect direction, this koan, if you will. Winter will last until clean water rises in the sacred well and bright flame burns on every hearth. What does she mean? The children asked. And their father says, that's the trouble with the goddess. It's hard to get a straight answer from her. Jesus, Confucius, and other spiritual icons spoke in parables equally unclear. Zen speaks in koans. Yahweh talked to Moses, a stutterer who's supposed to be the major communicator, through a burning bush. And Muhammad, who is illiterate, is suddenly writing metaphorical phrases in Arabic to people who are also illiterate. And one of their commandments, memorize the written word. We all know the story of Miracle on 34th Street, the mother who does not believe in fairy tales or Santa and insists on giving her child only the cold, hard, starkest truth of early 20th century reality as she knows it. In the end, the movie wants to teach us to believe. I'm not a huge fan of belief. As the Unitarian Universalist theologian James Luther Adams used to say, we all have a load of beliefs. It's what we believe that's important. But I am a fan of placing my faith in something including the possibility of a story filled with paradox or koans to teach us how to live more wisely and how to struggle more effectively with the paradoxes and koans of every single life, because all our lives have those moments. My experience with restorative justice for nearly a decade taught me a lot about this need to struggle with paradox. In the Vermont Restorative Justice Center, where I volunteered and later worked, a group of community volunteers come together to work with someone who has been convicted of a crime to begin to restore justice, to repair what was broken as best as they are able, and learn how to return to the community in a way that does not place them at risk for re-offending. Often the group of adults gathered too often with a very young adult, often a very immature young adult, wanted to tell them how to get from point A to point B to point C and point D and make things okay. And when we did that, we would invariably see that person back around our table sooner or later, because they had not struggled with learning the lessons. If we gave them the opportunity to struggle with what they did not understand, like the children in the story, they came to learn something invaluable that was a strength and a courage for the rest of their lives. It may be a weakness of our faith tradition that we no longer have a common liturgical story as Unitarian Universalists. A few people have tried to make one over the years, as we will hear in a moment. But perhaps this very weakness also gives us the strength to help and rewrite some of the old narratives in their rigid fusions, where they have excluded the difficult truths, erased the difficult truths, such as the truth of powerful, strong, valuable, feminine presence in the world of the soul, the world of the spirit, and in the physical world, such as the difficult truths of white supremacy and how it stole land, how it built riches on the backs of other people's labor, how it treated some people as not human. We need to include these difficult truths in our narratives because they make them real and richer, because like koans, we have both the terrible things that we do to one another as humans and the wonderful things that we do with one another as humans. We have death, and we also have this one wild and precious life, as Mary Oliver says. May we hold hope that we are able to learn, to hear, and to live more fully into the narratives that shape our values and our lives every year, and shape the cycles of life within, among, between, and beyond. Blue Boat Home, the hymn we will now sing on mute, except for Olga, was written by Peter Mayers to accompany one of those to make a narrative, The Big Story by Michael Barlow and Connie Dunn. And it was created to have a Unitarian Universalist liturgical story, one that upholds the sacred and holy process of evolution, honoring the creation and all its subsequent upgrades from Universe 1.0 to life on Earth 4.5 billion years later. Another source similar to that using Christianity that I recommend is Thomas Berry and Brian Swim's The Universe Story. Blue Boat Home gives us a metaphor and a story for this precious and wild planet on which we live those precious lives.
Reverend Abigail, you're speaking to mute.
Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Olga. I understand that is a congregational favorite. Let us go forth once again with these words from Anne Hillman about standing in a new doorway. We look with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which is every moment at the brink of death. For something new is being born in us, if we but let it. We stand at a new doorway, awaiting that which comes, daring to be human creatures, vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love.